The struggle continued whilst Mandela was in prison, his incarceration inspiring thousands of others to step up their activity. Part of the anti-apartheid struggle was, a significant part was the Black Power movement, which really came to prominence in the 1960s and 1970s, specifically in the United States, but also in South Africa. And some people have cited the popularity of the Black consciousness movement under the leadership of Steve Biko in South Africa as a response to what some people saw as the slow progress of the ANC leadership. What role do you think the Black Power movement played?
Well, every organization that campaigned against apartheid, in one way or the other, they would have played a significant role because apartheid was an inhuman system. But to say that the Black consciousness movement had come up with better programs other than the ANC, it will not necessarily be correct. I don't think that it will be necessary for us to compare them. They played the role that they played, but the ANC was constantly looking at its method of struggle. As I said earlier on, that look, it is the ANC that advocated for the armed struggle. The Spear of the Nation, Umkhonto weSizwe, was formed. It was the ANC that said that we must run the country ungovernable. We saw mass defiance campaign throughout the country. It's the ANC that went to exile, that was prisoned and so on. So it cannot be correct that Black consciousness came as a result. It was an ideological party. They made a contribution. It can never be underplayed, but it can never be overrated over and above the African National Congress.
The Black Power movement was very important in the struggle because it was a different way of approaching things and challenging things. It was about being loud, proud, black, out there, telling it as it is, standing up against racism, and actually it encouraged, inspired a mobilisation of people, not just in South Africa and the USA, but in the UK here. And actually there was a black sections of the anti-apartheid movement in the UK who related what was happening in South Africa to what was happening in terms of oppression and discrimination here in the UK and in the USA.
What is going on inside South Africa is influenced by developments elsewhere. In the 1950s, the civil rights protests in South Africa are influenced by the United States. And then I think in the 1960s and into the 1970s, you can see, again, coming from the United States, the influence of the Black Power movement on what's happening inside South Africa. That said, it's important to stress that very often the black struggle in South Africa has actually been setting an example to the rest of the world. It's not that it is drawing influence from other parts of the world, but it's also very often developing its own ways of struggle and being an inspiration to people fighting back elsewhere. But there's no question that black power emerges as an important force in black politics in South Africa, partly because there's a generation of youth, black youth in the townships, who feel that progress is very slow, and I think feel that the space has been emptied of the ANC, partly because of the shift to the military strategy. Putting all of your emphasis on the military strategy means that you're not organising in the townships in the same way. As the level of struggle begins to rise again and the possibility of mass struggle in the townships is there again, the ANC isn't necessarily in a position to provide leadership, and other forces fill that space. And that's what people like Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness movement are doing, I think, in that period.
In the Soweto township, protests turned to a year-long uprising. The state responded with the most extreme violence. Around 700 deaths were recorded, but it is likely that many more were killed. In 1979, African trade unions were legalised and economic resistance to apartheid entered a new phase. In 3 years, the number of black South Africans in the trade unions trebled. Strikes became an almost daily occurrence. Ordinary workers also began to challenge the state's attempts to co-opt the black middle class.
I think the trade union movement is essential. It's very important in South Africa and globally in fighting for rights, standing up against discrimination, standing up against abuse of workers' rights. And of course there was horrific abuse of workers' rights during apartheid. People were effectively treated like slaves.
The labour movement helped to organize black workers. It consolidated their voice. It ensured that their demand were able to be met to a certain extent. But as you know, that the dominance of capitalism in the economic world has always presented problems for the working class. So we continuously need to have stronger trade unions to fight these social contradictions. Because on the other hand, the capital is looking forward to make profit, but on the other hand, the working class is looking forward to make a living. So at any given time, we should strike the balance between those issues.
I think you can't really get a handle on the apartheid system, or indeed what's happening in South Africa today, unless you understand the inextricable link that there is between racism and capitalism in South African history. The racism of the apartheid system has its origins way before the development of apartheid per se, right back when British mine owners were establishing a way of controlling black labour with the development of the gold mining industry. Racism was used to divide working people. It was used as a justification for separating black workers from the workplaces and confining them to other parts of South Africa. So racial separation and white racial supremacy is inextricably linked with the development of South African capitalism. What that means in turn is that the black working class has always been absolutely central to the struggle against capitalism. And it is specifically the black working class, because the white working class was so privileged, so highly paid, it was effectively bought off by the white capitalist class and played no role in the liberation struggle, indeed provided very often the armed forces of the state that were being used to suppress black working class protest. And if you look at the history of South Africa, it's a whole series of working class upsurges, both in the workplaces with the development of trade union organisation and strike action, but also working class struggles in the community, in the townships, that have driven the struggle forwards and caused the struggle to rise again after periods of repression.
Outside South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement organised a campaign of protest and boycott. The South African economy slumped.
The anti-apartheid movement here in the UK were very important to the struggle, because they brought what was happening in South Africa into the public domain internationally, because it started in the UK but it was joined by other countries. They were instrumental in challenging the UK government and putting pressure on them to support sanctions, support the boycott campaign.
There was a very big anti-apartheid movement in Britain, and quite a lot of us who were activists in the 70s and the 80s were involved in that movement, because it wasn't just that South African apartheid was a particularly extreme form of racism. It was also that South Africa depended very heavily on British investment. A large number of British businesses were centrally involved in the exploitation of black labour and therefore in propping up the apartheid system. So campaigns in Britain which were targeting these companies that were propping up apartheid and also attacking British governments, successive British governments, which were in support of South Africa, which were not prepared to take action against South Africa. Britain was the key foreign prop of the regime, and that's why the anti-apartheid movement here was so important.
The South African state quickly came to the realisation that granting black South Africans some limited rights was probably preferable to the full-scale revolutionary upheaval of the black working class.
The stage has now been reached.
In 1989, F.W. de Klerk became president. He lifted the ban on the ANC and freed the leadership from prison. Finally, in 1990, Mandela himself walked free.
The release of Nelson Mandela after serving 27 years in prison was a grateful moment for all those who were involved in the revolution. Particularly for us as young people, I remember when the announcement was made, I was home. I heard the news and then I tried to go and see on TV. At that time, televisions were very scarce. I then relied on radio to listen to some of the updates. And in fact, in the first rally that President Mandela addressed, I went to the rally. I experienced the man because he was a mystery over time. To many of us who were young revolutionaries at the time, I could not have figured out his picture, how he looked like, because he was a kept secret. Only the apartheid government knew how Mandela looked like. We did not know how he looked like. So it was a fulfilling moment for South Africans, but also it was a moment of hope. We knew at the time that time had arrived for apartheid government to negotiate.
I think all of us who'd been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle found those pictures on television of Mandela appearing for the first time as a free man on the streets, I mean, immensely moving. I mean, he represented such an achievement of millions and millions of people, primarily in South Africa, but of course those who'd been involved in the solidarity movements abroad as well. He represented the pinnacle, really, of all of that, that campaigning. And I think that the other thing that might be said about it is that a lot of us were quite surprised that it had happened in this way. A lot of us thought that it was only going to be through a full-scale armed insurrection of the black working class that we would actually get rid of the system, because the white supremacist system with its 4 million heavily armed whites looked so immovable without violence. What we hadn't allowed for, I think, is the degree to which the South African ruling class itself would understand the danger, and that it was necessary to move towards some kind of negotiated settlement if they were going to be able to stabilise South African capitalism.